Well, good morning. It's good to be back with you guys again. It has been a while since I preached here, but I've been here a few other times. One of those times was our youth conference, I think we called it. And I just want to say thank you all for opening your building to us. That was a really awesome time for our youth and for me in particular. Not only did we have a time where we grew in the Word, but we played a lot of hide and go seek in this building, and there are a lot of great spots in here. And so, just thanks for allowing us to have fun. And we played some capture the flag in the field, and it was good to relive the glory days amongst middle and high schoolers. If you, for those of you who don't know my story, I'm a Dartmouth grad, way back class of 2017, and I got to play football at Dartmouth. My athletic achievements and feats are now all geared towards beating middle and high schoolers because that's about my athletic range now. So I lived out those glory days right out there on that field. So I appreciate you. Well, this morning we are looking at John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. We're slowly making our way through the book of John. And we have for us really two stories, two separate stories that usually we would parse out, but this morning we're going to put those two stories together. And they're really two stories that mark a major development for Jesus in the book of John. The first story deals with this huge crowd that comes to Jesus, and the second deals with this intimate scene of Jesus coming to his disciples. But both of these stories are connected, and we need both to understand this larger conversation that's going to come, and two responses people will have to Jesus as he talks to them about the nature of belief. Again, they're two stories, but they all actually happen within the same day. And let's just take a little step back and remember where we're coming from in the context of the book of John. We have just seen in chapter 5, Jesus has healed a man who was paralyzed for 38 years. And because of how Jesus responds to the accusations of him working on the Sabbath, there's this group of people ready to kill him as they hear that he's claiming equality with God. Back in John chapter 5, verse 18, it says that they're ready to kill him, not only because he's saying he's the Son of God, but he's also claiming equality with God. And their plans to kill him sparked this long monologue that we get from Jesus, where he doesn't back down from these claims of equality. It seems like he actually doubles down. And so, as we come to chapter 6, the stakes are pretty high for Jesus, right? Not only is he under threat of death, he has just doubled down on the things that brought him under threat. He's made some God-sized claims, and so he's either got to back these claims up, or he probably needs to go on the run, right? Well, here in chapter 6, I think, again, we see Jesus doubling down, not just in word, but also in deed. Because I think it's really the first time that Jesus reveals the fullness of who he is in both word and in deed. See, up until this point, we've got John's testimony, the gospel writer, about who Jesus is. He gives it to us in the prologue. And Jesus has slowly revealed different aspects of himself, but it hasn't been to the measure that John claimed in the opening 14 verses of his gospel. And so Jesus starts the process of revealing himself fully as he feeds the 5,000. And I think then he completes that process for his disciples as he comes walking out to them at sea. Now, there's no way that we can mine these 21 verses for all the nuggets and treasure that's in them, but I want us to at least attempt to take maybe a broad overview. And what I want to do this morning is I want us to see three things. I want us to see Jesus' provision as he provides for this crowd on the mountain. I want us to see Jesus' power as he comes to his disciples in the water. And then I want to look at our appropriate response. How should we respond to Jesus revealing himself to us in word and in deed? Okay, so again, we're going to look at Jesus' provision, his power, and then our response. So let's look at Jesus' provision. Well, this chapter begins with this great crowd of people coming to Jesus because of the healings that he was doing. And coming out of chapter 5, it actually might seem that everybody's out to kill him, but it's apparent that Jesus still has a pretty big following. Okay? And as Jesus sees this crowd, it's almost like he's trying to give himself some space. So he sees a large crowd following him, and then verse 3, it says, then Jesus goes up a mountain. Right? It's kind of an interesting thing for Jesus to do, to put space between him and a crowd. But these people must have been hardy New Englanders, because as Jesus takes this hike, the crowd follows him, right? Thousands of people go, that's no problem for us, Jesus. We'll come out to you, and you want to put some space between you and us? We'll go right up the mountain. And so this crowd follows him, and this crowd following him actually creates the tension that we have in the first part of our story, because we come to verse 5, and Jesus asks Philip a question. He says, Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? And notice who this question is for in verse 6. It's not for Jesus. Jesus is not asking Philip so that they can come together with a leadership strategy on how they might steward this crowd. This question is not for Jesus, it's for Philip, right? He says he said this to test him, for he himself, Jesus, knew what he would do. And I think this question that Jesus asked Philip is one that we also have to consider this morning. See, if we're going to follow Jesus and he starts walking into places that look scarce, where are we going to get our provision from? Maybe that means that our favor with man runs low because obedience starts to look countercultural. Maybe that means our mental and physical margins are diminished because, like the Good Samaritan, we come across an unexpected crisis and are compelled to help. Maybe that means our actual money runs low because we're supporting one another in the church generously. Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? It's not a question for Jesus, it's a question for his disciples. Jesus knows where the provision is going to come from, but he calls his disciples to consider where it might come from too. And Philip, as he considers the question, he answers it, I think, in a very logical way. He says in verse 7, Jesus, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. So he says to Jesus, not only is there no Wendy's nearby to send them to, but even if we had 200 denarii worth of bread, they'd all only get a little piece. You see, a denarius is only 1 day's worth of labor for an agricultural worker, right? So let's say a laborer went out into a field, he comes back, he gets 1 denarius. And so, again, Philip says, hey, even if we had 200 of those worth of bread, we couldn't feed these thousands of people. And he's right. It's a logical answer. We don't have the things necessary to feed these people, Jesus. He says it's impossible. But Andrew hears the same question, and he comes to Jesus not with a logical answer like Philip, but he comes with a very illogical answer. He comes to Jesus with this little boy, and he says, here's a little boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? You see, Andrew sees the same impossible situation that Philip is seeing. And he doesn't even bring Jesus a solution for everybody. He just brings what he has. And all he has is this little boy who's brought 5 loaves and 2 fish. And for Jesus, all that little boy has is enough. And I find it funny, the 2 details that John puts in before Jesus miraculously multiplies these fish and loaves. First, he has the people sit down. And this is not a men's conference, right? That has followed him up a crowd. It says that 5,000 men sat down, but that's just how they were counting at the time. There were more people with him, probably at least twice as many as the men, at least 10,000 people up on this mountain. So can you imagine, as Jesus sends these 12 men to these thousands of people, and they say, hey, we're about to eat, sit down, right? These people all have eyes. They all see Jesus and they all see the disciples. And what they don't see are any meal trays. They don't see any baskets full of anything. They don't see any servers walking up the mountain with these plates or baskets of food. So we're about to eat and we're sitting down. Why? And then secondly, after the people sit down, it says that Jesus takes this little meal that this little boy had brought. He takes the fish and the loaves and then he gives thanks. And if I'm Philip and Andrew and the disciples, I would have been thinking, Jesus, what are you giving thanks for? Are you giving thanks for leading all these people into an impossible situation? Are you giving thanks for this little kid who was one of the only people who came prepared for this hike, and now he has to give up his lunch so that everybody can nibble off of it? Thanks for what? Jesus, why are we sitting down? And why are we giving thanks? But after they sit down and Jesus gives thanks, he takes the 2 fish and the 5 loaves that this little boy offered up, and he multiplies it, feeding 5,000 men and everybody with them. I think what we learn from this scene is that it's not about what you bring, but it's about who you bring it to. Again, it's not about what you bring, but it's about who you bring it to. You see, when Jesus asks the question, where are we to buy bread to eat, it wasn't just to turn for Philip and Andrew and the rest of the disciples to turn and analyze the situation. It was ultimately to turn the disciples' attention back to Jesus. See, if Jesus led them into this scenario and all the people with him, were they going to trust him to provide? And I think that's an important thing for us to understand this morning because life is full of impossible situations. I'm sure some of you right now are sitting in some of those impossible situations. And it's funny because God, what this story tells us is that God is not afraid to lead us into some of those impossible situations. But they're not to punish us, and they're not even particularly to hone our analytical or leadership skills. That may happen in the process, but what these impossible situations are meant to do for us is they're meant to turn us to Jesus and trust him to take whatever we have and abundantly provide for us. See, it's funny because I feel like verse 13 is where probably this story should have started. It says, they gathered up all the leftover fragments and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. Wouldn't that have been great if Jesus turns to Philip and he says, hey, where are we going to get bread for all these people? And Philip could have gone, hey, we got 12 baskets. Let's just start distributing. But no, the story starts at impossible and it ends at abundance and overflow because that's who Jesus is. And the details of this scene, as people are experiencing this day, the details of the scene are so significant. And they come together just right. So you got the timing of the day being Passover. You've got the location being up on a mountain. You've got the miracle happening being food multiplied to feed masses that couldn't feed themselves. And it leads the people to make this exclamation in verse 14. It says, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. Now, why would they have made that exclamation? Well, I think they're picking up on this scene that's eerily similar all the way back in Exodus chapter 16. You see, back then, it was a similar impossible situation. The children of Israel had just left Egypt, and they're wandering in the wilderness, and they're grumbling, complaining to God, like, hey, we're out in the wilderness, and we have nothing to eat. And so what does God do? He provides manna for them and quail for them in the desert. And as they're experiencing the day and they're experiencing the timing, that would have also been close to Passover. Back in Exodus, they're saying, you feel a lot like the guy who fed a lot of people in the desert the last time. You feel a lot like Moses. And actually, these people would have been hanging on to a promise from God. As Moses gets older, God tells the people, one day I'm going to raise up a prophet to lead the people who is just like Moses. And so as people are experiencing Jesus this day, it says, that's got to be you. No one else in the history of our people has ever done this, and here you are up on a mountain feeding the masses. They said, this is a prophet who has come into the world. But then look what they do in verse 15. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus again withdrew again to the mountain by himself. I think in some ways it's an odd reaction by Jesus. I mean, you can imagine these people who are like, hey, we're ready to make you king. And Jesus just walks away, right? You can imagine the awkwardness in that moment. And I think still, too, like if we think about the storyline of the book of John, he has just gained thousands of witnesses. He needs to clear his name and to keep people from killing him, right? Chapter 5, verse 18, there are people out to kill him because he's making some inappropriate claims. And here he has thousands of witnesses to clear his name. But instead of submitting to their desires, he withdraws again to a mountain, which I think allows him to ultimately show his true power in the next story. Again, we could sit in the story all day, but in order to keep from preaching in a 2-hour sermon, let's keep moving to these next verses 16 through 21. So Jesus withdraws again to a mountain, and so that leaves the disciples alone. And in verse 16, they head to the other side of the sea. And if you notice in these first couple verses, in verse 16, 17, and 18, everything that happens to the disciples next is the exact opposite of what they'd experienced just earlier in the day, right? So in the day, they had just spent the day with Jesus, and now they're they're spending this first part of the night without him. Earlier, they are operating in light where John can give details like there's a lot of grass around and he can count the numbers of people and he can count the numbers of leftover food. But all John can say about this scene in verse 17 is it was now dark. Earlier, they're operating on top of a mountain, this solid rock, but now the only thing solid is the boat underneath their feet. Earlier, they're surrounded by grass. Now they're surrounded by the sea. Earlier, they were just sitting and watching Jesus work, and now they're having to row with their own two hands across the sea. You see, you take Jesus out of the equation, and the day for the disciples goes from one of the most powerful days of their lives to this quickly chaotic scene. You see, oftentimes in the Bible, the sea is used as a metaphor for chaos. And what I don't want you to hear me say is that this scene didn't really happen. We're just talking about some metaphorical chaos the disciples were going through and Jesus came to. I don't want you to hear me say that. But what I do want you to hear me say is that this scene represents something more than just 12 men trying to make it across a rough sea. See, the beginning of this story for the disciples tells us something about the nature of reality without God and how quickly things turn to chaos without him. And it's not that God is ever truly absent from us, but the reality of sin is that it plunges us into darkness so that without a relationship with him, we don't sense him. And even in relationship with God, the spiritual warfare that the devil wages feels like that same darkness. That's actually one of John's favorite analogies for the world before Jesus came is darkness. And what happens in darkness? It's chaos. It's disorder. here's an experiment for you. Just be in a room full of middle school and high school kids and turn the lights off. See what happens. First, you'll get loud screams, and then you might get someone crying because there might be things thrown and things like that. What happens in darkness? It's chaos. It's chaos. And this is where the disciples are in the midst of chaos, trying to pull themselves to the other side of the sea. And it's actually at this moment in the story that Jesus shows back up. And look what he's doing in verse 19. In the midst of this chaotic scene for the disciples, he's not coming and rowing a bigger boat next to them. He's not swimming out to meet them. He's not standing on the shore going, hey, y'all left me up on the mountain. Come back and get me. Right? He's doing something categorically different than what anyone would expect a man to be doing in this situation. He's just taking a casual stroll out on the water. Now there's this detail that John puts in the story. It says that the disciples are 3 or 4 miles out. And as you look at this journey, it would have been about a 5-mile journey for the disciples to get from one part of the sea to the other. So what that means is not only does Jesus show up walking on the water, he's almost come all the way across the sea. This is an utter display of the power of Jesus Christ. I mean, think about the ways that people in power usually get around, right? It's not like normal people. So back in the days before they had cars, maybe they had carriages and things like the kings and queens would be carried around on poles. Or not on poles, they would be carried around on these carriages with men walking with poles on them. If now, think about maybe the president of the United States, what would it take for him to get here to a service at Christ Community Church? Well, he'd probably take off from Air Force One, and all other planes around him would be grounded, right? Nobody would be able to take off or land. And he might land maybe in the Lebanon airport, and then he would get in this huge motorcade, and he would be rushed here. And he would come in, and there would be people surrounding him, Secret Service, also that he could sit down. Why? Because the power of a person is displayed in the way that they travel. Well, here's Jesus with his power on display, walking on the water. See, there's only one person whose power needs no help crossing land or sea, and that's Jesus. He doesn't need help over his creation because he created it. And he doesn't need help over navigating the chaos of the world because he is in full control. See, we may be feeling like we're barely making it in the midst of our chaos. We may be feeling like we're rowing to the other side, but not so for Jesus. He has complete power over us and whatever battles we're facing. And it says that as the disciples see the full power of Jesus on display, they're terrified. And I think we like to ridicule the disciples a lot, right? Like you see Jesus walking and Like, why are you scared? And I think partly because we know the end of the story. We know that it's actually Jesus. And I think partly because we also don't know, I don't know that we trust that these are real firsthand accounts. And why I say that is because imagine for a second you are in this scene, that you're in that boat. Imagine you're struggling out to sea and you are rowing to the other side. And you see this man walking towards you. Your first instinct, and my first instinct, would not be to break out into your favorite hymn or worship song. Why? Because never in your life have you seen anything like this. This is a power that is otherworldly, whether you believe in God or not. See, they see this person they see is not only walking on water, but he's walking on water towards their boat. And they're already in a vulnerable situation because of the chaos of the sea. And so, whatever this person on the water decides to do next is a difference between life or death for them. See, they're not in control of their situation as it is, and they're certainly not in control of this man who's out on the water. And so, what does Jesus say to calm their fears? He says, "It is I. Do not be afraid." It is I. Do not be afraid. It's such a simple statement. But let's break it apart. See, let's start with the first part of it. Jesus says, "It is I." And what would this have meant for the disciples? Well, in one sense, it would have just meant it's Jesus, right? The disciples would have been used to his voice and his shape, the way that he walks, because they had been following him for so long. And so basically, when Jesus says, "It is I," in one sense, he's saying it's me. It's the guy you've always known and the guy you've always walked with. But in another sense, he's saying something much deeper than that. And we really have to go again all the way back to the book of Exodus to understand. You see, in Exodus 3, we get the story of Moses and the burning bush. And God had just called Moses to go and deliver the people of Israel. And he's having this back and forth with God about why he's severely underqualified to do so. And so he's kind of giving God all these excuses. And then he asks God this question. He says, "Hey, let's say theoretically I do go and deliver these people. What if they ask me your name? Who should I say that you are?" And God responds to Moses like this. He says, "I am who I am." He says, "Say this to the people of Israel: I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say this to the people of Israel: the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations." You see, in the Greek, this name that God wants to be remembered by, all the way back in Exodus, is translated ego eimi. Ego, just the word I, eimi, the verb to be. So, in a sense, ego eimi means I am. And that's the exact Greek phrase that's used here in verse 20. As translated, "it is I." So, in one sense, as Jesus says, "It is I," he's saying, "Hey, it's me, the guy you've always known, the guy you've walked with for all this time." But in another sense, as the fullness of his power is on display on the water, he pronounces his title. And he says, "I am," saying it's me, the God you've always known. Right? I'm not just the guy you've always known, but I'm also the God you've always known. I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. I'm this Jesus who just multiplied bread on a mountain, but I'm also the same Jesus who multiplied bread all these years ago for the Israelites. It is I. And that then leads him to go on to say, "Do not be afraid." And why, again, what do you have to say? Don't be afraid, because let's rehash the story. They're out on the water. There's chaos. There's someone walking towards you, and then you find out it's the all-powerful, all-knowing God. I mean, have you have you ever stood in the presence of somebody you didn't know they were important as you thought they were? I think about the story, the show Undercover Boss. Right? You guys ever seen that show? If you haven't, it's a show where the CEO or a higher up of a company, he or she just kind of lives life with some employees for a week or a month. I can't remember the amount of days. And so uh, you Joe Schmo, who's making minimum wage at McDonald's, just think you meet a new fry cook and you're teaching him the ropes. But then all of a sudden you get this summons to the CEO of McDonald's office at the end of a month, and you walk in and you go, "I thought you were just a fry cook." Right? And now it turns out that this person I've been interacting with all this time actually is one of the highest up people in all of our company. Well, that's exactly what the disciples are going through on this moment. Hey, you were cool, but we never knew that you were actually the God of the universe. We never knew that you are I am. Of course, they would be afraid. In a sense, they're saying, I know who you are, but now I know who you are. But Jesus again tells them that they have nothing to fear because this new revelation of who he is doesn't cancel out any of the former revelation that they had had. See, this Jesus is the same Jesus who had made the first move towards them long before this storm, long before this chaos. In that step towards them was not a step of destruction, but it was a step of love and care. And they had no reason to fear that he was going to act any differently. As a matter of fact, as they continue to interact with him, they should only expect that they would continue to see his love and his care for them more fully on display. You see, what we'll see as we'll continue to go through the book of John is that Jesus is going to continue to reveal himself through his provision and his power. And all along the way, he'll continue to make these I am statements to go along with him. For some, his power and his provision will cause them to love him, but for some, it will cause their hatred and their anger to grow to the point where they want to kill him. See, there's only two other times where Jesus says, ego eimi, plainly. And the last one is as this mob of people comes looking to arrest Jesus in the garden. And he asks him as they show up in the garden, who are you seeking? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says in the garden, he says, that's me, ego eimi, I am. And this statement is so powerful that it knocks people to the ground. And so as people collect themselves, he says again, who are you seeking? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. As he makes that statement, he says, I told you, I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go. See, on the sea, we get Jesus' words that his disciples have nothing to fear, that his people have nothing to fear. And that in itself is enough assurance. But in the garden, we get his actions as he protects his disciples and allows himself to be arrested, put on trial, and crucified. I mean, you talk about chaos. Talk about things not being as they should be, things being disordered. Talk about darkness. I mean, Jesus has done nothing but reveal himself to be God in the flesh, come for the redemption of his people. And so, what would compel a people to arrest him, to beat him, to mock him, to put a crown of thorns on his head and crucify him? And even more importantly, why would Jesus let that happen? Doesn't Jesus know what life is like for his people when he's not with them? Doesn't he know the chaos that ensues when the lights are turned out? Well, he allows himself to be crucified because the cross is the very place his power and his provision are on full display. On the cross, his power and provision we don't just get a picture of who he is, but he starts to change who we are. And it's true, Jesus did and does have the power to stop his own suffering. But in doing that, he would have been saving himself and leaving us at the mercy of the chaos of our own sin. Instead, he allows himself to be crucified so that he can break the power of sin and provide life to all those who call on his name. See, Jesus doesn't come to just sprinkle a little healing or here or a little breakthrough there or a little bread on a mountain, but he comes so that you and I might have life and life more abundantly. And he does that by conquering chaos, taking it, and breaking it in himself. And so we see Jesus' provision on the mountain, we see Jesus' power on the water. But what's our proper response to all this? I mean, we have this data, but what do we do with that? How should that truth change us? Well, let's look at our last point, our appropriate response. You see, I say appropriate response because there seem to be two responses that people have to Jesus in these stories. Again, remember back in verse 14, the people see what happens when Jesus feeds the thousands on the mountain, and they say, this is a prophet who has come into the world, and they want to take him and make him king. But he leaves going up a mountain, signaling that they have made some kind of mistake. And again, it's kind of a head-scratching moment because he was acting very Moses-like, right? I mean, he did the very thing that Moses did for the people. And who wouldn't want to be made king, especially Jesus, whose life was under threat just a chapter before? But on the sea, we get why that was such a wrong statement for the people to make, because Jesus isn't a new Moses who needs to be king. He is the God of the universe who now is in complete control of all things. He is the Word who is God, who created all things, made flesh. And so, what are we called to do with the God of the universe? How are we called to respond to him? It's not to make him king. As a matter of fact, if we feel like we have the power to make Jesus king over anything, our view of him might be too small, right? These people say, hey, you've got power, we've got influence, we'll make you king. But if Jesus is who he says he is, he's already king. He already has that spot. And so whatever definition of kingship that they have for Jesus to come is different from the one he's already living into, which is why he withdraws. So that's not why I came. We're not called to make him king over things. We're called to allow him to rule over our own lives. You see, if you look at the story of Jesus walking on the water, at no point does Jesus ask to get in the boat, right? And you can imagine, Jesus has walked 3 or 4 miles. He's come all the way to the other side of the sea. And at no point does Jesus say, hey, fellas, can I get a ride? And it makes sense because he's already walked that far. Jesus doesn't need a ride. He doesn't need any help. He's all powerful, even over his creation. But what happens is that the disciples go from being afraid of him to asking him to come on board. If you look at verse 20, 21, it starts with the words, then they were glad to take him into the boat. And the word that's used there can be translated desired or wished. But it's not this idea of wishing that we usually have, like, it'd be nice if that happened. Like, I wish I had $1 million. That'd be really nice if it happened, right? But it's not that idea of hoping or wishing. It's more of the idea that you're resolved to make it happen. And so as Jesus pursues them, he transforms their fears into pursuit of him. See, they forget all about the storm that's going on. They forget all about their desire to make it to the other side. And in that moment, they want nothing more than to have Jesus on board with them. Because in that moment, they know what they need is not a better boat. They don't need a better mindset to help them row. They don't need more strength. They need the one who can walk on water in the boat with them. So that even if their strength runs out, even if their boat breaks out, he will be able to hold them up. And that's exactly what Jesus does for us. He transforms us. See, he doesn't just provide for our physical needs, though he does that. He doesn't just strengthen us to endure chaos, though he does that. He doesn't just reorient our minds to be able to navigate chaos, though he does that too. And he doesn't just give us a more sturdy vessel to withstand chaos. That's what the church is for. And he does that. He provides us people to walk through this life with. But what Jesus does ultimately is he allows us to live in relationship with the God who created us, which is what we are ultimately created to do. So that even when our minds fail, our strengths fail, our bodies fail, even when we feel like our church fails us, we will not perish. And so if our goal this morning is just to get more stuff, it's just to get more bread from Jesus, he'll continue to be a frustrating character. Actually, that's going to be the dispute that's going to happen in these coming verses. But if our goal is to get him, to be in relationship with him, then there's no amount of chaos that can keep him from coming to us. And at the very same time, he promises to provide for our every need. And so I want to leave us with a couple challenges today. First is, if you don't know Jesus, my challenge to you this day is if you haven't received him into your boat, do that today. If you haven't received him into your life, he has pursued you to the point of death so that you might be in relationship with him. He has traveled through chaos to get to you, and he's willing to walk with you if that's what you desire. And so if you haven't received Jesus, my challenge to you today is to receive him. But if you do know Jesus, I also have a challenge for you. And my challenge to you is to continue to pursue him, especially in the midst of chaos. I think we often think we get to know best by, we often think we get to know God best by having time to sit down and to think and have our our quiet devotional times. But what these passages tell us is that God does meet us in impossible and chaotic times. How did these people come to understand that Jesus was indeed like Moses, like a prophet? It's because he led them up a mountain, and without him, they would have starved. How did the disciples come to know that Jesus had the power even over creation? It's because they got in a boat, went to the other side of the sea, and Jesus came out walking to him. Arguably, some of the best times of Jesus revealing himself fully in word and deed did not come in times of prosperity or in times of peace, but in times of hardship, chaos, impossible situations. And so if you do know Jesus, continue to pursue him even in the midst of those times. God is not hindered by the chaos of our lives. He moves towards us in it for our good. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your word, and we thank you for all of these things that you have done, Lord. We thank you for your provision. We thank you for your power. And we thank you, Lord, that the same way that you provide and show your power all those years ago, Lord, in these firsthand accounts, Lord, you continue to do that today. And it's because the cross was not the end of the story for you. You were resurrected, and you do now live making intercession at the right hand of the Father for your people. And you have given us the same Spirit that rose Jesus from the dead. And so I pray, Lord, that you would help us to desire you. Lord, that we might not get distracted by the cares of this world and the shiny and flashy things that come to distract us, that we wouldn't even be hindered by the chaos and the suffering of this world, but that we would be good ground, that as your Spirit comes to us, that we would bear fruit, that we would appropriately respond and go from fearing you inappropriately to desiring nothing more than to be in relationship with you. And this is a work that only your Spirit can do. And so, Holy Spirit, we ask you to do it. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, thank you, Abram. Another timely, solid message for those in this body and for everyone.